For your crimes, you are hereby sentenced to death.
I don't regret it. I'd do it again. I'll kill all of you. Let's move.
The birthday balloons still bobbed lazily against the ceiling of the Wilson suburban Portland home as Detective Sarah Hall ducked under the crime scene tape on the evening of January 27, 2022. What should have been a night of teenage celebration had transformed into a tableau of unimaginable horror in the basement recreation room, where the bodies of two 13-year-olds, Shannon Lewis and Ricky Wilson, lay side by side on the beige carpet, their hands nearly touching in what investigators would later describe as a deliberately arranged position. Blood had pooled beneath them, seeping into the carpet and spattering the walls in a spray pattern that suggested frenzied, repeated knife wounds delivered with extraordinary force despite the attacker's young age. The birthday cake on the nearby table remained half-eaten. "Happy Birthday, Ricky," written in blue frosting across its surface, 13 candles still planted in neat rows, never to be blown out by the boy who now lay dead beside his friend. If you're watching this video, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more true crime coverage. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we dive deeper into this shocking case that rocked the Pacific Northwest and sparked a national conversation about juvenile justice. Emergency services had responded to a frantic 911 call placed at 8:43 p.m. by Derek Wilson, Ricky's father, who had gone to check on the teenagers after hearing what he described as a thud and then silence from the basement where 7 kids had been celebrating. Upon discovering the bloody scene, Mr. Wilson had rushed the remaining partygoers, 5 terrified children, upstairs and away from the carnage before calling for help, his voice barely coherent as he told the dispatcher that they're just kids. They're just children. Oh, God. The first responders had arrived within minutes, but it was immediately clear that both victims had been dead for at least 20 minutes, their bodies already growing cold in the basement that had been decorated with basketball-themed streamers for Ricky's birthday party. Shannon Lewis, a popular 8th grader with long brown hair and a reputation for kindness, had sustained 17 stab wounds to her chest and neck, while Ricky Wilson, the birthday boy and star of the middle school basketball team, had 23 wounds, primarily to his face and throat. The 5 surviving children, huddled in blankets in the Wilsons' living room, appeared to be in various states of shock, unable to provide coherent accounts of what they had witnessed. One girl, trembling violently, could only repeat, "Milo did it, Milo did it," when gently questioned by a female officer trained in dealing with traumatized minors. Another boy vomited repeatedly into a wastebasket, unable to form words at all, his glasses smudged with tears and his party clothes spattered with his friend's blood from when he had tried unsuccessfully to help. Detective Hall noted that one child was conspicuously absent from the group of survivors. Milo Johnson, a classmate of the victims who had reportedly left the party early, telling the adult hosts he wasn't feeling well and would walk the 3 blocks to his home. The brutality of the crime scene suggested a level of rage rarely seen even by veteran Portland homicide detectives, who photographed evidence with grim, tight expressions. Bloody footprints led from the bodies to the basement bathroom, where the sink contained traces of diluted blood, suggesting the killer had attempted to wash up before leaving. A kitchen knife from the Wilsons' own cutlery set, identified by Mrs. Wilson through tears as the one I used to cut the birthday cake earlier, was found partially hidden under a basement sofa, its handle wiped clean, but its blade still coated in the victim's blood. The most disturbing aspect, noted Detective Hall in her initial report, was not just the number of wounds or the weapon used, but the care with which the bodies had been arranged after death, positioned side by side, faces turned toward one another, hands nearly touching, in what appeared to be a grotesque parody of affection. Parents began arriving at the scene in waves of disbelief and horror, their headlights cutting through the dark Portland evening as news spread rapidly through text messages and phone calls. Carla Lewis collapsed on the front lawn when told about her daughter Shannon, her screams echoing down the quiet residential street, as her husband Vincent held her, his own face frozen in shock. Margaret Wilson, Ricky's mother, had to be sedated by paramedics after seeing the birthday decorations she had hung that morning, now surrounded by crime scene tape. The entire neighborhood seemed to converge on the scene, standing in silent vigil behind police barricades as rain began to fall, dampening clothes but doing nothing to wash away the collective horror. Detective Hall, watching the growing crowd from the porch, noticed that Milo Johnson's parents were conspicuously absent, despite living just 3 blocks away in this close-knit southeast Portland community. As the medical examiner carefully examined the bodies, he confirmed what the positioning had suggested. The victims had been killed where they were found, but then deliberately arranged after death. Shannon's body showed defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, suggesting she had fought desperately against her attacker, while Ricky's injuries indicated he might have been taken by surprise, perhaps trying to defend Shannon rather than himself. The medical examiner pointed out to Detective Hall that the depth and force of the wounds were remarkable, given that they were suspected to have been inflicted by a 13-year-old, noting, "Whoever did this was operating on pure adrenaline and rage. It multiplied their strength." Crime scene technicians collected fibers, fingerprints, and DNA samples from throughout the mall basement, but their most significant find came when examining the victims' cell phones recovered from their pockets. Shannon's phone displayed a direct message from an Instagram account called "Watching You Always Dr. 13, received just 8 minutes before the estimated time of death, reading simply, "I see you with him. You'll regret this." Outside, the January rain intensified as Detective Hall stepped onto the porch to call for an officer to be dispatched to the Johnson residence. Behind her, technicians continued processing the basement crime scene, their camera flashes visible through the windows, like lightning illuminating the most innocent of settings, transformed into the most sinister. Parents of the surviving children huddled together under umbrellas across the street, their faces pale with shock as they whispered the same question over and over. How could one child do this to 2 others? The sidewalks began filling with teenagers from the local middle school, drawn by social media reports of something terrible happening at Ricky's party, their faces illuminated by phone screens as they messaged friends and family in real time. As Detective Hall ended her call, a patrol officer approached with news that would accelerate the investigation. A Shell gas station 3 blocks from the Wilson home had surveillance footage of a blood-spattered Milo Johnson disposing of what appeared to be clothing in their outdoor dumpster less than an hour earlier. The fluorescent lights of the Shell station cast an artificial glow across the rain-slicked parking lot as Detective Sarah Hall reviewed the surveillance footage with the night manager, a man in his 50s who kept shaking his head in disbelief. The timestamp on the grainy black and white recording showed 9:08 p.m., approximately 40 minutes after the estimated time of the murders, when a slight figure in a dark hoodie approached the outdoor dumpster at the side of the building. Despite the hood pulled low over his face, when the boy looked up briefly toward the security camera, there was no mistaking the features of 13-year-old Milo Johnson, his expression eerily blank, as he tossed a plastic bag into the dumpster before walking quickly away in the direction of his home. The night manager, who had been alerted to the police presence at the nearby Wilson residence, told Detective Hall that he hadn't noticed the boy at the time, but added, "That kid comes in here all the time for energy drinks and candy, always quiet, always alone." Detective Hall immediately dispatched officers to retrieve the bag from the dumpster, while simultaneously sending a patrol car to the Johnson residence 3 blocks away with instructions to secure the premises, but wait for her arrival before making contact. The plastic bag, when carefully removed from the dumpster by officers wearing evidence gloves, contained exactly what Detective Hall had feared: a blood-soaked hoodie and jeans, still wet to the touch, with what appeared to be a blood-stained sneaker wrapped inside them. A quick examination suggested the blood pattern was consistent with someone standing close to the victims during the frenzied knife attack, with heavy saturation on the front of the hoodie and spatter patterns on the pants that matched the close-range stabbing motion described by the medical examiner. Detective Hall placed a call to Judge Carolyn Martinez, waking her at home to request an emergency search warrant for the Johnson residence based on the new evidence, explaining the time-sensitive nature of the situation involving a juvenile suspect in a double homicide. With the signed warrant transmitted to her phone 20 minutes later, Detective Hall arrived at the modest two-story home on Maple Street, where the Johnson family had lived for the past 8 years. The house was dark except for a single light visible in an upstairs window, a stark contrast to the flashing emergency vehicles still illuminating the Wilson home just 3 blocks away. Anthony and Diane Johnson answered the door in bathrobes, their initial expressions of confusion quickly transforming to defensive anger when Detective Hall identified herself and explained why she was there with 4 uniformed officers. "This is ridiculous. Milo came home early from the party with a headache and went straight to bed," Diane insisted, her voice rising as she tried to block the doorway despite the warrant Detective Hall displayed on her phone. "He's just a child. He wouldn't hurt anyone, let alone his friends." Upstairs, officers found Milo Johnson awake and sitting on his bed in pajamas, a gaming controller in his hands, though his television screen was dark, suggesting he had turned it off when hearing the commotion downstairs. The 13-year-old boy, small for his age, with sandy blonde hair and freckles across his nose, showed no surprise at the officer's appearance in his doorway, merely setting down his controller and asking in a flat voice, "Is this about Ricky's party?" Detective Hall, who had followed the officers upstairs, noted the boy's unnervingly calm demeanor and the fresh scratch marks visible on his right forearm when his sleeve rode up. Milo's bedroom was meticulously organized, with books arranged by height on shelves, gaming equipment precisely aligned on his desk, and a collection of basketball trophies, smaller than the ones Detective Hall had seen displayed in Ricky Wilson's room, arranged in perfect rows. The bathroom connected to Milo's bedroom showed signs of recent use. A damp towel hung over the shower rod, the sink was still wet, and the distinct smell of soap hung in the air. As officers began searching the Johnson home, cataloging evidence and taking photographs, Anthony Johnson paced the living room, demanding to call their family attorney, while Diane sat rigid on the sofa, repeatedly stating, "There has to be some mistake." In the kitchen, officers discovered a pair of sneakers soaking in the utility sink, the water tinged faintly pink, despite what appeared to be liberal amounts of dish soap added to it. The matching sneaker to the one found in the dumpster was located at the back of Milo's closet, partially hidden under winter boots, but still visibly stained with what appeared to be dried blood. Most damning of all, when officers removed Milo's mattress during their search, they discovered a kitchen knife wrapped in a blood-stained T-shirt that Mrs. Wilson would later identify as matching the set from which the murder weapon had come, suggesting Milo had taken a second knife but ultimately not used it. At the Portland Police Bureau's Central Precinct, Interview Room 3 had been prepared for a juvenile suspect, with appropriate accommodations made according to Oregon state law requiring parental presence during the questioning of minors. Detective Hall sat across from Milo, with Anthony and Diane Johnson flanking their son and Marcus Emerson, their hastily summoned attorney, sitting at the end of the table with a yellow legal pad. The room's recording equipment captured the scene. A small, freckled 13-year-old boy in a Portland Trail Blazers T-shirt provided by his parents, his own clothes having been taken as evidence. His expression largely impassive as Detective Hall explained the purpose of the interview and read him his Miranda rights in age-appropriate language. "Milo, we have video of you throwing away bloody clothes at the Shell station after leaving Ricky's party," Detective Hall said gently but firmly, sliding a still image from the surveillance footage across the table. "We need you to tell us what happened tonight." Milo's first statement, delivered in a clear voice while staring directly at Detective Hall, established the defense narrative his attorney would maintain throughout the coming legal proceedings. "I didn't kill them. I found them like that." The 13-year-old claimed he had gone to the basement bathroom during the party and returned to find Shannon and Ricky already dead, causing him to panic, get blood on himself while checking if they were alive, and then flee the scene out of fear. Anthony Johnson immediately jumped in to support his son's story, stating, "He's just a kid who got scared. Anyone would run if they found something like that." Diane Johnson began quietly crying, her hand on Milo's shoulder, as she repeated, "My baby wouldn't hurt anyone," while Attorney Emerson made notes and occasionally whispered in Milo's ear before the boy answered questions. Detective Hall, maintaining a calm, non-confrontational approach appropriate for a juvenile suspect, asked Milo why he had disposed of his clothes if he had merely discovered the bodies, to which the boy responded, after a glance at his attorney, "I was scared people would think I did it because I had blood on me." As the interview continued past midnight, Milo maintained his story with remarkable consistency for a 13-year-old, showing little emotion, beyond occasional fidgeting and glances at his parents. When Detective Hall asked about his relationship with Shannon Lewis, however, a subtle change came over the boy's demeanor. His shoulders tensed, his eyes darted away, and he began picking at his fingernails under the table. "She was just a girl from school," he stated flatly, contradicting statements from other party attendees who had described Shannon as Milo's crush and mentioned that they had been seen kissing at a school dance 2 weeks earlier. Anthony Johnson interrupted again, his voice rising defensively. "What does that have to do with anything? My son found his friends murdered, and you're asking about some schoolyard crush?" Detective Hall noted in her report that throughout this portion of questioning, Milo's facial expression remained eerily blank, while his physical mannerisms, the nail-picking, a slight rocking motion, the tension in his jaw, suggested significant emotional activation beneath the surface. Near the end of the initial 2-hour interview, Detective Hall placed a sealed evidence bag containing Milo's phone on the table, explaining that it had been recovered from his bedroom and would be analyzed by the digital forensics team. For the first time, genuine alarm flashed across Milo's face as he stared at the phone, his composure cracking momentarily before his attorney placed a hand on his arm and requested a break. When questioning resumed 15 minutes later, Milo appeared to have regained his composure, answering Detective Hall's questions about the phone with rehearsed responses. "It's just my regular phone, and I mostly use it for games." Detective Hall made a show of writing down his answers while making a mental note of his reaction to the phone, suspecting it might contain crucial evidence that could break through the boy's carefully maintained story. As the interview concluded for the night, with Milo to be held in juvenile detention pending formal charges, Detective Hall watched the Johnson family huddled together with their attorney in the hallway, Anthony's arm protectively around his son's shoulders, Diane weeping quietly, and Milo himself staring at the floor with the same unsettling flatness he had maintained throughout most of the questioning. The next morning, as rain continued to fall over Portland, the digital forensics team made their first breakthrough in the case. Milo's phone, once unlocked using his birthday as the passcode, revealed an Instagram account under his own name with typical teenage content, basketball photos, video game screenshots, and school activities. A deeper search, however, uncovered a second Instagram account logged in on the same device. Watching, You'd always 13. The same account that had sent the threatening message to Shannon Lewis minutes before her murder. Detective Sarah Hall reviewing the forensic report in her office with a cup of coffee, growing cold beside her, felt a chill that had nothing to do with January weather as she scrolled through the account's activity. The profile, created exactly 2 weeks earlier, the day after the school dance where Milo and Shannon had reportedly kissed, contained no posts but had sent over 200 direct messages to Shannon's account, ranging from declarations of love to increasingly disturbing threats when she stopped responding, culminating in the final message sent from the Wilson home's Wi-Fi network at 8:35 p.m. on the night of the murders. The digital forensics lab at the Portland Police Bureau hummed with activity as Detective Sarah Hall stood behind senior technician Jason Myers, watching him navigate through the data extracted from Milo Johnson's iPhone. The technician's fingers moved methodically across the keyboard, bringing up screen after screen of direct messages sent from the Watching You Always 13 account to Shannon Lewis over the previous 2 weeks. The account was created on January 13, 2022, Myers explained, pointing to the timestamp. That's the day after the Westside Middle School winter dance, according to the school calendar we pulled. The messages began innocuously enough, with simple texts like, "Had fun dancing with you," and "You're the prettiest girl in 8th grade," but quickly escalated when Shannon's responses became less frequent and eventually stopped altogether 3 days after the dance. From that point forward, the messages transformed from teenage admiration to something far more disturbing. "Why are you ignoring me? I saw you laugh when you read my text. I know when you're online and not answering, and I deserve a response after what we shared." What made the evidence particularly damning was the methodical nature of the digital stalking revealed through the forensic analysis. Milo had not only created the fake account specifically to contact Shannon after she began ignoring his messages from his regular account, but he had also used it to follow all of her friends, systematically documenting her activities and whereabouts through their public posts. Myers demonstrated how the account had taken screenshots of Shannon's Instagram stories and saved photos she was tagged in, creating a virtual timeline of her movements over the 2-week period. He was essentially building a surveillance file on her, Detective Hall noted grimly, as Myers pulled up a folder containing dozens of saved images of Shannon, at basketball games, at the mall with friends, even walking to school, all captured from other people's social media without their knowledge of how the images were being used. The obsessive documentation revealed a level of premeditation that contradicted Milo's claim of merely finding his friends after they had been killed by someone else. The messages grew increasingly disturbing in the 3 days leading up to the birthday party murder. "I see how you look at Ricky now," read one sent on January 24th. "You think I don't notice, but I see everything," stated another. From January 25, "You were my first kiss, not his," declared a message from the morning of January 26th, suggesting Milo had somehow learned or suspected that Shannon had become interested in Ricky. The frequency of the messages had also accelerated, with 78 sent in the final 24 hours before the murders, many containing language that alternated between declarations of love and explicit threats. "We belong together," followed hours later by, "You'll regret playing with my feelings." The final message, sent at 8:35 p.m. on January 27th from the Wilson home's Wi-Fi network, "I see you with him. You'll regret this," was time-stamped just 8 minutes before the estimated time of the murders, based on the medical examiner's report. Technician Myers then turned to the location data extracted from Milo's phone, which painted an even more disturbing picture of his behavior in the weeks leading up to the crime. The GPS tracking showed that Milo had frequently walked past Shannon's house in the evenings, sometimes remaining stationary across the street for up to 30 minutes at a time. He established a pattern of physically stalking her as well as digitally, Detective Hall observed as Myers displayed a map with Milo's movement patterns highlighted in red, showing repeated loops past Shannon's home, despite it being in the opposite direction from his usual routes to school or the basketball court. Most concerning were the browser searches found on the phone, including queries for how to make someone regret rejecting you, what happens if a minor commits murder, and most damning of all, a search from the night before the murders that read, how to make two people stay together forever. When confronted with this digital evidence during his second interrogation, Milo Johnson's carefully constructed facade began to show its first significant cracks. Seated once again in interview room 3 with his parents and attorney present, the 13-year-old visibly flinched when Detective Hall placed printouts of the Instagram messages on the table between them. "Milo, we know you created the Watching You Always 13 account to contact Shannon after she stopped responding to your regular account," Detective Hall stated calmly, watching the boy's face for reactions. "We also know you sent her a threatening message from Ricky's house just minutes before they were killed." Anthony Johnson immediately objected, his face flushed with anger or embarrassment, or perhaps both, as he insisted, "Those messages don't prove anything about the murders." But Detective Hall noticed that Diane Johnson had gone very still beside her son, her earlier defensive posture now replaced with something closer to horrified realization as she stared at the printouts. Milo's response, when it finally came, introduced a new element to his story, while still maintaining his innocence in the actual killings. "I was upset with Shannon because she kissed me at the dance and then started ignoring me," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made that account because I wanted her to talk to me again, but I didn't hurt her or Ricky." His attorney quickly interjected, suggesting that while the messages showed typical teenage jealousy, they didn't constitute evidence of murder. Detective Hall then placed another document on the table, the search history, showing Milo's query about how to make two people stay together forever from the night before the murders. "This search is particularly interesting, Milo," she said gently, "because it matches exactly how Shannon and Ricky were found, positioned side by side, as if you wanted them to be together in death." For the first time, tears appeared in Milo's eyes, though Detective Hall noted in her report that they seemed to be tears of frustration rather than remorse, as he insisted, "That's not what I meant by that search." Meanwhile, in another part of the precinct, Detective Carlos Ramirez was interviewing the 5 surviving children who had attended Ricky Wilson's birthday party, with appropriate parental consent and child advocates present. 13-year-old Zoe Chen's testimony proved particularly valuable, as she had been at both the winter dance and the fatal birthday party. Shannon and Milo danced together a couple songs at the winter dance, and they kissed at the end of the night, she confirmed, fidgeting with the sleeve of her sweater as she spoke. Shannon told me later she thought it was a mistake because she didn't really like him that way, but he kept texting her. Zoe went on to describe how Shannon had eventually stopped responding to Milo's messages and had recently begun showing interest in Ricky instead. At the party, Shannon and Ricky were kind of flirting all night, and Milo kept watching them with this weird look on his face, she stated, her voice breaking slightly at the memory. Then they kissed while we were playing Truth or Dare, and Milo the way he looked at them was scary. The digital evidence continued to mount as technicians analyzed Shannon Lewis's phone, recovered from her pocket at the crime scene. Her text messages revealed conversations with friends expressing discomfort about Milo's persistent attempts to contact her after the dance. "He won't stop texting me," she had written to her friend Avery on January 16th. "I told him I just want to be friends, but he keeps saying we had a connection when we kissed." Another message to her friend Jaden on January 20th read, "Milo is creeping me out. I think he followed me home from basketball practice yesterday." Most revealing was a text she had sent to Ricky Wilson the morning of the party. "Excited to see you tonight. Milo will be there, but just ignore him if he gets weird again." The digital trail painted a clear picture of Shannon's growing discomfort with Milo's attention and her developing feelings for Ricky instead, a narrative that directly contradicted Milo's portrayal of events but aligned perfectly with the prosecution's emerging theory of jealousy-fueled rage. In a crucial breakthrough, the digital forensics team discovered that one of the party attendees, 14-year-old Tyler Washington, had been recording short videos throughout the evening for his TikTok account. Most were typical birthday party content, kids singing to Ricky, opening presents, playing games. But one video, time-stamped at 8:17 p.m., approximately 26 minutes before the estimated time of the murders, captured the truth or dare game Zoe had mentioned. In the 15-second clip, Shannon could be seen kissing Ricky on a dare, both teenagers blushing and laughing afterward while their friends whooped and teased them good-naturedly. The camera had then panned around the room, capturing the reactions of the other partygoers, and for a brief 3 seconds, Milo's face filled the frame. Detective Hall felt a chill run down her spine as she studied the frozen image of the 13-year-old boy's expression, his eyes narrowed, jaw clenched, and a look that multiple witnesses would later describe in court as pure hatred directed toward the laughing couple. The digital evidence compiled over the first 48 hours of the investigation was presented to District Attorney Thomas Blackburn, who made the decision to charge Milo Johnson as an adult despite his young age, citing the premeditated nature of the crime and the digital trail showing escalating threats. The evidence shows a disturbing level of planning and intent that goes well beyond typical teenage impulsivity, Blackburn stated during the press conference announcing the charges. The defendant methodically stalked his victim online for weeks, searched for information about murder, and sent an explicit threat minutes before carrying out a brutal double homicide. The announcement that a 13-year-old would be tried as an adult for first-degree murder sent shockwaves through the Portland community, with parents, educators, and child welfare advocates expressing a complex mixture of horror at the crime itself and concern about the decision to treat such a young defendant as an adult in the legal system. As the digital evidence against Milo continued to accumulate, Prosecutor Olivia Wright began constructing a narrative that would form the backbone of the state's case. The Instagram messages, location data, search history, and TikTok video collectively told the story of a rejected first love that had spiraled into obsession and ultimately violence. The digital footprint left by the defendant provides us with a clear timeline of escalation, Wright explained to her team during their strategy session. From the creation of the fake account after being rejected, to the increasingly threatening messages, to the searches about murder, to the final threat sent minutes before the killings. It's all there in black and white. What made the case particularly strong, she noted, was how the digital evidence aligned perfectly with the physical evidence, the bloody clothes in the dumpster, the murder weapon from the Wilsons' own kitchen, and, most significantly, the deliberate positioning of the bodies that matched Milo's search for how to make two people stay together forever. In the modern era of criminal prosecution, Wright observed to her team, the digital trail often revealed more about a perpetrator's state of mind than any confession ever could. The Portland County Courthouse stood imposing against the gray February sky as Prosecutor Olivia Wright ascended the steps, case files tucked under her arm, and reporters calling questions from behind the police barricade. It had been 2 weeks since the murders of Shannon Lewis and Ricky Wilson, and today marked the formal arraignment where Milo Johnson would enter his plea to the charges of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Inside the courtroom, the 13-year-old defendant sat beside his attorney, Marcus Emerson, looking even smaller than his already slight stature in the oversized suit his parents had purchased for the proceedings. Wright had prosecuted juvenile cases before, but never one where a child so young was being tried as an adult for such a heinous crime, and she felt the weight of both public scrutiny and ethical complexity as she arranged her materials at the prosecution table. Behind her, the gallery was filled to capacity. Shannon's and Ricky's families seated in the front row, their faces hollow with grief. The Johnsons on the opposite side, Diane's eyes red-rimmed from constant crying, and behind them, rows of community members and journalists there to witness a case that had already begun generating national headlines about juvenile justice. Judge Elias Blackwell, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for running a tight courtroom, called the proceedings to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. "The state of Oregon versus Milo Johnson," the clerk announced, and Wright watched as the judge looked down at the 13-year-old defendant with an expression that betrayed no emotion whatsoever, though his next words made his position clear. Given the severity of the charges and the significant digital and physical evidence presented in the preliminary hearing, this court has already ruled that the defendant will be tried as an adult despite his age, Judge Blackwell stated, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent courtroom. "Mr. Johnson, you are charged with 2 counts of murder in the first degree in the deaths of Shannon Lewis and Richard Wilson. How do you plead?" Marcus Emerson stood alongside his young client, placing a supportive hand on Milo's shoulder as the boy's voice cracked when he responded, "Not guilty, Your Honor." In her office later that afternoon, Prosecutor Wright met with her team to outline their strategy for what promised to be one of the most high-profile cases in Portland's recent history. The defense will center entirely on Milo's age and supposed emotional immaturity, she explained to her junior, prosecutors and the case detectives, including Sarah Hall. They'll argue that a 13-year-old lacks the capacity to form the kind of intent necessary for first-degree murder, regardless of the digital trail showing premeditation. Wright pulled up slides showing the key pieces of evidence they would build their case around. The fake Instagram account and its escalating messages, the surveillance footage from the gas station, the TikTok video capturing Milo's expression of hatred, and the deliberate positioning of the bodies that contradicted his claim of merely discovering the victims. "Our narrative is straightforward," she continued, tapping her pen against the conference table for emphasis. Milo Johnson experienced his first kiss with Shannon Lewis, became obsessively attached, and then flew into a murderous rage when he saw her kiss his friend Ricky instead, a rage that was not impulsive, but the culmination of 2 weeks of escalating digital stalking and threats. Defense attorney Marcus Emerson, meanwhile, was constructing a very different narrative in his preparation for trial. In a meeting with the Johnsons at his downtown Portland office, he explained his approach while Milo sat silently beside his mother, staring at his hands folded in his lap. "We don't dispute that Milo was at the scene or even that his actions resulted in the deaths," Emerson explained carefully, watching the parents' faces crumple at his words. "What we're arguing is that he lacks the neurological development to have formed the specific intent required for first-degree murder." Emerson had already lined up expert witnesses in adolescent psychiatry and neurological development who would testify that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and understanding consequences, is nowhere near fully developed in a 13-year-old. "The digital evidence shows he was upset and jealous, yes, but not that he planned to kill anyone," Emerson continued. "We'll argue that he saw Shannon and Ricky kissing, had an age-appropriate emotional meltdown without the adult capacity to regulate it, and tragedy resulted, making this at most a case of voluntary manslaughter, not premeditated murder." The discovery phase of the trial revealed the prosecution's intent to use Milo's own developmental psychology against him in a strategy that Wright described to Detective Hall as letting his immaturity convict him. Rather than disputing the defense's claims about adolescent brain development, The prosecution would argue that Milo's digital behavior showed exactly the kind of immature, all-consuming first love obsession that a teenager might experience, and that this obsession was precisely what motivated the murders. We're not claiming he thought about this like an adult criminal mastermind, Wright explained as they reviewed the evidence together. We're saying he thought about it like a rejected, obsessive teenager who decided if he couldn't have Shannon, no one could, especially not his friend, who he believed had betrayed him. This approach would allow the prosecution to acknowledge Milo's youth while still arguing for the premeditated nature of the crime, using his own developmental stage as the lens through which to understand his actions rather than as an excuse for them. A key breakthrough for the prosecution came when digital forensics technician Jason Myers discovered a pattern in the Instagram messages that strengthened their case considerably. "We've analyzed the timing and frequency of the messages from the fake account," he explained to Wright and Detective Hall, displaying a chart on his computer screen. "There's a clear escalation pattern that correlates directly with Shannon's increasing interactions with Ricky. The chart showed that spikes in message frequency and aggressive language coincided with days when Shannon had posted photos with Ricky or been tagged in his posts. Most damning was a series of increasingly threatening messages sent the night before the murders, after Shannon had changed her profile picture to one showing her and Ricky together at a school basketball game. This isn't just random teenage jealousy, Myers pointed out. The data shows a direct causal relationship between seeing Shannon and Ricky together online and escalating threats toward them, culminating in the final message sent from the party itself. The battle over expert witnesses intensified as both sides prepared for trial, with the defense and prosecution lining up mental health professionals with opposing views on adolescent criminal responsibility. Dr. Vanessa Meadows, a child psychiatrist with 20 years of experience specializing in adolescent development, had been retained by the defense to testify about the limitations of teenage brain function. A 13-year-old simply lacks the neurological hardware to fully comprehend the permanence of death or to control impulses in emotionally charged situations, she explained during her pretrial deposition. Milo was experiencing his first rejection alongside the perceived betrayal by a friend, a perfect storm of emotional triggers that overwhelmed his underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. The prosecution countered by retaining Dr. Robert Chen, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in juvenile offenders, who would testify that while adolescents do have developmental limitations, Milo's pattern of behavior, particularly the creation of the fake account and the escalating threats over time, showed a level of planning and intent that exceeded typical impulsivity, regardless of his age. As jury selection began, both legal teams faced the challenge of finding jurors who could approach the case without being overwhelmed by either the defendant's youth or the brutality of the crime. "We need jurors who can separate their emotional response to seeing a child in the defendant's chair from their evaluation of the evidence," Wright instructed her team as they reviewed the jury questionnaires. The defense, conversely, needed jurors who could relate to the concept of teenage emotional volatility, preferably parents of adolescents who understood firsthand how dramatically a child's personality could change during puberty. The process took 4 full days, with over 100 potential jurors questioned before the final panel of 12 plus 4 alternates was seated. The jury skewed slightly older than average, with 9 women and 3 men, 7 of whom had teenage children of their own, a composition that both legal teams viewed as potentially advantageous to their opposing narratives. The local media coverage intensified as the trial date approached, with the Portland Tribune running a front-page series examining the case from multiple angles: the lives of the victims, the psychology of adolescent violence, and the ethical questions surrounding trying children as adults. National outlets picked up the story as well, framing it within larger debates about juvenile justice reform and the appropriate boundaries between youth rehabilitation and public safety. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered daily, divided into two camps, those holding signs demanding justice for Shannon and Ricky with their school photos enlarged and laminated, and those with placards reading, "He's still a child," and 13 is too young to be tried as an adult. The case had touched a nerve in the national consciousness, forcing uncomfortable conversations about when a child stops being a child in the eyes of the law, and whether the juvenile justice system was equipped to handle cases of such extreme violence committed by such young perpetrators. The night before opening statements, Prosecutor Olivia Wright sat alone in her office, reviewing her notes one final time as rain lashed against the windows. She had prosecuted murderers before, but never one who still had braces on his teeth and whose feet didn't quite reach the floor when he sat at the defense table. The evidence against Milo Johnson was overwhelming. The digital trail, the physical evidence, the eyewitness accounts. But Wright knew that convicting a 13-year-old of premeditated murder would require convincing the jury to see past his youth to the calculated nature of his actions. Across town in his own office, defense attorney Marcus Emerson was making final adjustments to his opening statement, centered around brain scans showing the vast differences between adolescent and adult neural development. Both attorneys knew that beyond the legal arguments lay a fundamental philosophical question that each juror would have to answer. At what age does a child become fully responsible for even the most heinous actions? With the eyes of the nation watching, the trial that would attempt to answer that question in the case of Milo Johnson was set to begin at 9 a.m. the next morning. The interrogation room in the Portland Police Bureau's Central Precinct was intentionally designed to be neither threatening nor comfortable. Beige walls, a simple table bolted to the floor, and chairs that discouraged both relaxation and intimidation. It was in this neutral environment that Detective Sarah Hall conducted her third interview with Milo Johnson, now 5 days after the murders of Shannon Lewis and Ricky Wilson. The 13-year-old suspect sat with his parents and attorney as before, but Hall had made one strategic change to the room's setup. A laptop displaying a slideshow of Shannon's Instagram photos now sat open on the table, silently cycling through images of the victim smiling with friends, playing basketball, and in one particularly poignant shot, posing with Ricky at a school function. "I'd like to talk about your relationship with Shannon," Detective Hall began softly, noticing how Milo's eyes kept darting to the screen despite his obvious effort to ignore it. "We know she was more than just a girl from school, like you said before." The psychological strategy behind Detective Hall's approach had been carefully developed in consultation with Dr. Amara Patel, a forensic psychologist who specialized in adolescent offenders. 13-year-olds are in a developmental limbo, Dr. Patel had explained during their planning session. They're old enough to plan and execute complex deceptions, but lack the emotional regulation to maintain those deceptions under pressure, especially when confronted with emotional triggers. The slideshow was designed as just such a trigger, a constant visual reminder of Shannon as a living, laughing person rather than an abstract victim, making it harder for Milo to maintain emotional distance while discussing her. Anthony Johnson immediately objected to what he called psychological manipulation of a child. But Detective Hall calmly pointed out that they were simply discussing the victim of a crime Milo claimed to have witnessed, and his attorney reluctantly allowed the questioning to continue with the slideshow running. "Shannon kissed me at the dance," Milo finally admitted after several minutes of increasingly uncomfortable silence, his voice barely audible as a photo of Shannon in her winter dance dress appeared on the screen. "It was my first kiss, and then she just stopped talking to me." Detective Hall nodded encouragingly, maintaining a gentle, almost maternal tone designed to feel safe for an adolescent while simultaneously undermining the formal defenses he had constructed with his attorney's help. "That must have hurt your feelings," she observed, watching as Milo's carefully blank expression flickered with the first genuine emotion he had shown in their interviews. "Yeah, it did," he responded, his voice taking on a harder edge as he added, "She led me on and then just ghosted me." Anthony Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his chair while Diane reached for her son's hand, which he pulled away, a gesture Detective Hall noted in her mental record of the interview dynamics. The breakthrough moment came not through aggressive questioning, but through a carefully orchestrated presentation of digital evidence designed to provoke an age-appropriate reaction. "Milo, I'm going to show you something, and I'd like you to explain it to me," Detective Hall said, turning the laptop to display the TikTok video from the party showing Shannon kissing Ricky during the Truth or Dare game, followed by 3 seconds of Milo's face contorted with rage. The effect on the 13-year-old was immediate and dramatic. His composure collapsed entirely as he watched the video, his face flushing red and tears welling in his eyes. "They planned it," he blurted out, before his attorney could stop him, his voice cracking with emotion. "They wanted to embarrass me in front of everyone." This outburst, what Dr. Patel would later describe as a developmentally typical externalization of blame, provided the first crack in Milo's carefully maintained story of innocently discovering his friends already dead. With this emotional barrier breached, Detective Hall shifted tactics slightly, now focusing on what Dr. Patel had identified as a key vulnerability in adolescent psychology, the need for recognition and understanding. "I can see how hurt and angry you felt, Milo," she said, her voice conveying empathy without excusing the actions that followed. "When you saw them kiss, after Shannon had been your first kiss, just 2 weeks earlier, you felt betrayed by both of them, didn't you?" The targeted validation produced exactly the response the psychology team had predicted. Milo's defensive posture softened slightly as he nodded, seemingly relieved to have his emotional experience acknowledged rather than dismissed. "Ricky knew I liked her," he said quietly, staring at the table. "He was supposed to be my friend, but he went after her anyway." For the first time in any of the interviews, Milo's parents appeared truly shaken, exchanging a glance that suggested they were beginning to question their absolute faith in their son's innocence. Detective Hall then employed another technique developed with Dr. Patel, designed to leverage adolescent emotional processing, contextualized confrontation with evidence. Rather than simply presenting the Instagram messages in an accusatory manner, she framed them within the emotional narrative Milo himself had just established. "When Shannon stopped responding to your regular account after the kiss, you created a new one so you could keep talking to her," she stated, presenting it as an understandable action rather than sinister stalking. "And when she still didn't respond the way you wanted, your messages got angrier because you felt rejected and embarrassed." She placed printouts of some of the later messages on the table. "I see everything," and "You'll regret playing with my feelings," watching as Milo's eyes scanned the words he had written. "I just wanted her to talk to me again," he mumbled, a statement his attorney immediately tried to qualify by adding, "which is normal teenage behavior and not evidence of any criminal intent." The parents' presence in the interrogation room created a complex dynamic that Detective Hall deliberately leveraged in her questioning strategy. Adolescents are hyper-aware of parental judgment, and Milo's relationship with his parents, particularly his father Anthony, who had been aggressively defensive on his son's behalf in earlier interviews, created both a pressure point and a potential opening. "Milo, when you sent this message," Hall pointed to the final threat sent from the party's Wi-Fi, "what exactly did you want Shannon to regret?" The question hung in the air as Milo glanced nervously at his father, whose expression had grown increasingly troubled as the interview progressed. "I don't know," Milo finally answered, his voice small. "I was just mad." Diane Johnson began crying quietly beside her son, her hands twisting a tissue into shreds, while Anthony sat rigidly upright, his earlier certainty visibly crumbling as the evidence mounted and his son's responses became increasingly damning. The most effective psychological tactic in breaking down Milo's story came when Detective Hall introduced what Dr. Patel had called the moral mirror, confronting him not with accusations but with the contradictions in his own narrative that challenged his self-image. "You've told us you just found Shannon and Ricky already dead, but then you made a very specific choice about what to do next," Hall said gently, placing a crime scene photo on the table showing the victims positioned side by side, faces turned toward each other. "You arranged them like this, didn't you, Milo? To be together forever, just like you searched for online the night before." The 13-year-old stared at the photo, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid as the carefully constructed compartmentalization of his actions began to collapse. "I didn't want them to be like that," he whispered, a statement that was neither a confession nor a denial, but revealed the emotional truth beneath his actions. He hadn't wanted Shannon and Ricky to be together, in life or in death. Yet, in his final act, he had ironically ensured they would be forever linked. Marcus Emerson called for a break at this point, recognizing the dangerous territory his young client was entering, but the damage to Milo's defense had already been done. When they returned to the interrogation room 30 minutes later, Emerson announced that while his client maintained his plea of not guilty, they would be pursuing a mental health evaluation to assess Milo's capacity to understand the nature of his actions at the time of the incident. Detective Hall nodded, making a note in her file while observing the Johnson family dynamic with trained eyes. Diane now sat slightly apart from her son, her body language suggesting a new uncertainty, while Anthony had abandoned his previously combative stance and simply looked defeated. Milo himself appeared drained by the emotional breakthrough, sitting slumped in his chair and looking, for the first time since his arrest, truly his age, a confused, troubled 13-year-old boy who had committed an adult crime but lacked the emotional maturity to fully process what he had done or why. Following the interrogation, Detective Hall met with Prosecutor Olivia Wright to review the recorded session and discuss its implications for their case. "We broke through the rehearsed story his attorney had constructed," Hall explained as they watched key moments from the interview. "He hasn't explicitly confessed, but his responses to the TikTok video and the positioning of the bodies give us the emotional motive we needed to connect the physical evidence." Wright nodded, making notes as they reviewed Milo's reaction to seeing Shannon kiss Ricky in the video. "That expression isn't just normal teenage jealousy," Wright observed. "That's the face of someone whose entire world has collapsed, which is exactly how a 13-year-old might experience rejection combined with perceived betrayal by a friend." The prosecutor's strategy was coming into focus. Rather than arguing against Milo's youth and emotional immaturity, they would use these very qualities to establish the motive and intent behind his actions, painting a picture of an adolescent whose first romantic rejection had triggered a catastrophic failure of impulse control, resulting in violence that was emotionally driven but nonetheless deliberately executed. In a parallel track to the ongoing legal proceedings, the Portland Police Bureau had assigned a team to analyze Milo's home environment and background, searching for any warning signs that might have been missed. Detective Carlos Ramirez, interviewing teachers and coaches at Westside Middle School, discovered a pattern that added another dimension to the psychological profile being built. He was always the kid on the periphery, Milo's basketball coach explained during his interview. Not quite good enough to be a starter like Ricky was, but desperately wanted to be part of that popular group. His English teacher reported that Milo had recently written a creative writing assignment about a boy whose friend betrays him and steals the girl he loves, which she had found concerning enough to make a note in his file, but not alarming enough to report to counselors. Most revealing was the interview with the school counselor, who disclosed that Milo had requested a schedule change in early January to be in more classes with Shannon, saying she was his girlfriend, despite Shannon later telling the counselor they were just friends, after she noticed Milo following her between classes. The courtroom fell silent as Prosecutor Olivia Wright approached the large screen set up for evidence presentation, the jurors leaning forward in anticipation. Your Honor, the state would like to enter into Evidence Exhibit 23, a video recorded at Ricky Wilson's birthday party approximately 20 minutes before the murders occurred, Wright announced, her voice steady despite the gravity of what the court was about to witness. Judge Blackwell nodded his permission, and Wright pressed play on the laptop connected to the projection system. The TikTok video began innocently enough, teenagers laughing during a game of truth or dare, the birthday boy, Ricky Wilson, grinning as he was challenged to kiss Shannon Lewis. The young couple's nervous, giggly kiss lasted only a second, followed by playful teasing from their friends. Then the camera panned, capturing the reactions of the other partygoers, and there was Milo Johnson, his face twisted in an expression so filled with hatred that several jurors visibly recoiled. Wright paused the video on this frame, letting the image burn into the consciousness of everyone in the courtroom. Witness after witness has described this expression as pure hatred, Wright continued, gesturing to the frozen image of Milo's face. This is not the face of confusion or surprise, ladies and gentlemen, but of murderous intent forming in real time. At the defense table, Milo Johnson stared down at his hands, unable or unwilling to look at his own face projected for all to see, while his attorney Marcus Emerson scribbled notes furiously. Behind them in the gallery, Diane Johnson covered her mouth with her hand, seeing for the first time the visual evidence of her son's state of mind moments before the killings. Wright allowed the silence in the courtroom to stretch for several uncomfortable seconds before continuing. 20 minutes after this video was recorded, Shannon Lewis and Ricky Wilson lay dead, stabbed multiple times with savage force, and then carefully arranged side by side, a grotesque parody of the connection the defendant had just witnessed and couldn't tolerate. Tyler Washington, the 14-year-old who had recorded the TikTok video, took the stand next, dressed in a suit that seemed at least one size too large for his lanky frame. "I was just recording random stuff all night for my social media," he explained, his voice cracking with adolescent nervousness as he faced a courtroom filled with adults. When Shannon and Ricky kissed during Truth or Dare, everyone was laughing and stuff, but when I turned the camera around, I saw Milo looking at them like... The boy paused, struggling to find the words, before finally saying, like he wanted to kill them. Defense attorney Emerson immediately objected to the characterization, which Judge Blackwell sustained, instructing the witness to describe what he observed without speculation about intent. Tyler nodded apologetically before continuing. His face was all scrunched up, and he was gripping his soda can so hard it was crushing in his hand, and he was just staring at them without blinking. It was super intense, and it kind of freaked me out. On cross-examination, Emerson worked to create a more sympathetic interpretation of Milo's expression in the video. "Tyler, you're 14 years old, just about Milo's age, right?" When the boy nodded, Emerson continued gently, "Have you ever had a crush on someone who liked someone else instead?" Tyler shifted uncomfortably before admitting, "Yeah, I guess." Emerson nodded understandingly. "And did it hurt your feelings when you saw them together?" The boy conceded that it had, allowing Emerson to suggest, "So, isn't it possible that what you saw in Milo's face wasn't hatred, but just the hurt feelings of a 13-year-old boy seeing the girl he liked kissing someone else? Tyler considered this for a moment before responding with unexpected certainty. "No, sir, I know what being upset looks like. This was different. It was colder." The answer clearly wasn't what Emerson had hoped for, and he quickly concluded his questioning, but not before the damage to his narrative of normal teenage jealousy had been done. Digital forensics expert Jason Myers took the stand next, presenting the court with a detailed timeline that correlated Milo's online activities with real-world events. At 8:17 p.m., the TikTok video shows Shannon and Ricky kissing during the Truth or Dare game, Myers explained, displaying a chart on the courtroom screen. At 8:35 p.m., 18 minutes later, the defendant sent a message to Shannon from his fake Instagram account, reading, "I see you with him. You'll regret this." Myers then pointed to the next item on the timeline. According to the cell tower data from the defendant's phone at 8:38 p.m., he moved from the main area of the basement to a more isolated corner, consistent with the location of the basement bathroom where multiple witnesses testified he went shortly before the murders. The timeline continued, showing that Shannon's and Ricky's phones had registered their last active use at approximately 8:43 p.m., the estimated time of death based on the medical examiner's report. What made Myers's testimony particularly compelling was his analysis of the pattern of Milo's social media usage in the weeks leading up to the murders. "We observed a clear escalation in both frequency and aggressive content," he testified, showing the jury a graph where the bars representing message frequency grew progressively taller over the 2-week period. The language in the messages evolved from admiration to obsession to explicit threats, with significant spikes occurring whenever Shannon was seen interacting with Ricky online. Myers then displayed side-by-side screenshots, Shannon's Instagram post showing her and Ricky at a basketball game posted on January 26th, and the subsequent flood of increasingly threatening messages sent from Milo's fake account that same evening. This pattern demonstrates that the defendant's fixation was specifically triggered by perceived romantic competition from Ricky Wilson, culminating in the final threat sent immediately after witnessing them kiss in person. The most damning digital evidence, however, came when Myers testified about the search history found on Milo's phone. On January 26th, the night before the murders, the defendant conducted a series of Google searches, he explained, displaying the list for the jury. These included, "How to make someone regret rejecting you," "What happens if a minor commits murder," and most significantly, "How to make two people stay together forever." Myers then split the screen to show this final search alongside a crime scene photo of the victims, positioned side by side, their faces turned toward each other. The positioning of the bodies directly corresponds to this search query, Myers concluded, suggesting that the arrangement was not random, but a deliberate fulfillment of the concept the defendant had researched the night before the murders. In a strategic move, Prosecutor Wright called Zoe Chen to testify immediately after the digital evidence presentation, knowing that the 13-year-old's first-hand account would humanize the technical data Myers had just presented. Zoe, who had been friends with both Shannon and Milo before the murders, spoke softly but clearly as she recounted the events leading up to the tragedy. "Shannon told me Milo was her first kiss at the winter dance, but she said she only did it because everyone was watching and she didn't want to embarrass him," Zoe testified, nervously tucking her hair behind her ear. "After that, he kept texting her all the time, and she showed me some of the messages where she told him she just wanted to be friends, but he kept saying they had a special connection." Zoe went on to describe how Shannon had become increasingly uncomfortable with Milo's attention, eventually blocking his regular account on Instagram, only to begin receiving messages from the Watching You Always Us 13 account that she suspected was Milo but couldn't prove. Zoe's most impactful testimony came when Wright asked her about Shannon's developing feelings for Ricky Wilson. They started hanging out more after winter break, and Shannon really liked him, Zoe explained, her voice breaking slightly. She was worried about Milo finding out, though. The day of the party, she texted me saying she was nervous because both Ricky and Milo would be there. When Wright asked why Shannon had been nervous, Zoe glanced briefly at Milo before answering. She said Milo had been following her home from school and showing up places where she would be, and it was creeping her out. On cross-examination, Emerson tried to suggest that Shannon might have been exaggerating Milo's behavior due to typical teenage drama, but Zoe stood firm. Shannon wasn't like that. She was actually really nice to Milo, even when he was being weird. She told me she didn't want to hurt his feelings, but she was definitely scared of him by the end. The testimony that perhaps most dramatically undermined the defense's narrative of an impulsive, emotionally overwhelmed adolescent came from Emily Tanner, a 14-year-old who had been in the basement bathroom shortly before the murders. "I was fixing my makeup when Milo came in," she testified, visibly nervous but determined. "He seemed really calm, not upset at all, which was weird because everyone had just seen Shannon and Ricky kiss during the game." Emily described how Milo had washed his hands super thoroughly and checked his reflection in the mirror, making eye contact with her through the glass. "He smiled at me, but it was wrong somehow," she said, struggling to articulate what had disturbed her. "Then he said something I thought was strange at the time. He said, 'Some things can't be fixed, but some things can be made right.'" Emily testified that she had left the bathroom immediately after this interaction, feeling uneasy, and had gone upstairs to get a drink, which was why she wasn't in the basement when the murders occurred minutes later. The defense strategy shifted visibly following the powerful testimony about the TikTok video and Milo's behavior immediately preceding the murders. Rather than continuing to claim Milo had merely discovered the bodies, Emerson began laying groundwork for a diminished capacity argument, calling Dr. Vanessa Meadows to testify about adolescent brain development. The prefrontal cortex, which controls impulse regulation, consequence assessment, and emotional processing, is significantly underdeveloped in a 13-year-old, Dr. Meadows explained, displaying brain scan comparisons between adolescent and adult brains. This neurological reality means that when faced with intense emotional triggers, such as seeing a romantic interest with someone else, an adolescent literally lacks the brain structure to process those emotions the way an adult would. Meadows went on to describe how this developmental limitation could result in a temporary dissociative state where a young teen might act without full awareness or control, particularly in situations involving perceived rejection, which adolescents process in the same brain region as physical pain. Prosecutor Wright's cross-examination of Dr. Meadows strategically avoided challenging the science itself, instead focusing on applying it to the specific evidence in Milo's case. Dr. Meadows, would creating a fake Instagram account to continue contacting someone who has blocked you require planning and forethought, she asked. Meadows acknowledged that it would. And would researching how to make two people stay together forever the night before arranging murder victims in that exact position also require planning? Again, Meadows had to concede the point. So, while we accept that adolescent brains process emotions differently, Wright continued, the evidence in this case shows a pattern of deliberate actions taken over time, not a single impulsive moment of lost control, correct? Meadows attempted to qualify her answer by discussing the complexity of adolescent behavior patterns, but the damage to the diminished capacity argument had been done. Milo's actions, while perhaps influenced by his developmental stage, showed too much planning to be dismissed as a momentary loss of control. As the sixth day of trial testimony concluded, Judge Blackwell instructed the jury to avoid media coverage of the case, but the warning seemed almost unnecessary given how thoroughly the evidence itself had captivated their attention. The TikTok video showing Milo's expression of hatred had become the visual centerpiece of the prosecution's case, a frozen moment capturing the transformation from jealousy to murderous intent. In the public gallery, Shannon's and Ricky's families sat with quiet dignity, occasionally holding hands across the aisle that separated them, united in grief for their children who, in the cruelest of ironies, would indeed be together forever, in the memories of everyone who knew them. On the opposite side of the courtroom, the Johnson family's section had grown increasingly empty, as friends and extended family who had initially come in support gradually stopped attending, leaving only Milo's parents sitting alone each day, their faces gray with the weight of their son's actions, gradually becoming undeniable even to them. The clinical precision of Dr. Eleanor Fontaine's testimony stood in stark contrast to the emotional weight of the crime scene photographs displayed on the courtroom screen. As the Portland Police Bureau's senior forensic pathologist, Dr. Fontaine had performed the autopsies on Shannon Lewis and Ricky Wilson, and now stood before the jury detailing her findings with professional detachment. The victims sustained multiple stab wounds delivered with significant force, she explained, using a laser pointer to indicate the wound patterns visible in the photographs. Shannon Lewis had 17 stab wounds concentrated in the chest and neck area, while Ricky Wilson had 23 wounds primarily to the face and throat. What made Dr. Fontaine's testimony particularly relevant to the prosecution's case was her analysis of the attack sequence, which directly contradicted Milo Johnson's claim of having merely discovered the bodies. The blood spatter evidence and wound patterns indicate that Shannon was attacked first, with Ricky likely coming to her defense based on defensive wounds on his hands and forearms, she testified, showing images that caused several jurors to wince and look away. Most crucially for the prosecution's narrative, Dr. Fontaine presented detailed evidence about the positioning of the bodies. Based on lividity patterns, the settling of blood after death, and the directionality of blood flow, it is clear that both victims were moved after death, she stated firmly. They were not killed in the positions in which they were found. Using digital reconstructions, Dr. Fontaine demonstrated how the victims had fallen separately during the attacks, but were then deliberately arranged side by side, their faces turned toward each other, and their outstretched hands placed nearly touching. This arrangement required someone to physically move both bodies after death, with blood evidence indicating this occurred approximately 5 to 10 minutes after the final wounds were inflicted, she concluded. This was not their natural position after falling during an attack, but a deliberate post-mortem arrangement. Defense attorney Marcus Emerson, recognizing the damage Dr. Fontaine's testimony had done to any remaining claim that Milo had merely discovered the victims, shifted his cross-examination to focus on the physical strength required to inflict the wounds and move the bodies. Dr. Fontaine, would you say that inflicting stab wounds of this depth would require significant physical strength? He asked. The pathologist considered before responding. The depth of penetration suggests considerable force, but adrenaline can significantly enhance strength, particularly in circumstances of extreme emotional arousal. Emerson pressed further. And moving two bodies after death, would that also require substantial strength? Dr. Fontaine nodded. Under normal circumstances, yes, but again, in a state of adrenaline-fueled arousal, even a physically underdeveloped adolescent could accomplish it. The bodies were moved only slightly to create the arrangement, not carried any significant distance. When Prosecutor Wright called crime scene technician James Kobayashi to the stand, the focus shifted to the physical evidence connecting Milo Johnson directly to the murders. We recovered a kitchen knife from under a basement sofa at the Wilson residence, Kobayashi testified, displaying the evidence in a sealed, transparent container. This knife, which Mrs. Wilson identified as part of their household cutlery set, had been wiped clean on the handle, but still contained blood residue in the grooves where the blade meets the handle. DNA analysis had confirmed this blood belonged to both Shannon Lewis and Ricky Wilson, with the pattern of blood residue suggesting the knife had been used on both victims. Kobayashi then presented the clothing recovered from the Shell Station dumpster, a hoodie, jeans, and one sneaker heavily stained with the victim's blood. The blood spatter pattern on these items is consistent with someone standing in close proximity while delivering multiple stab wounds, he explained, showing magnified images of the characteristic spatter patterns. These are not the clothes of someone who merely discovered bodies and checked for signs of life, as the defendant initially claimed. Perhaps most damning was Kobayashi's testimony about evidence found in Milo's bedroom during the initial search. Under the defendant's mattress, we discovered a second kitchen knife wrapped in a blood-stained T-shirt, he stated, displaying the evidence. Mrs. Wilson identified this knife as also belonging to their household. SET and DNA analysis confirmed the blood on the T-shirt belonged to Shannon Lewis. This evidence directly contradicted Milo's claim of having no prior intent, suggesting instead that he had taken not one but two knives from the Wilson kitchen earlier in the evening, using one in the murders and bringing the other home, perhaps as a souvenir or backup weapon. Kobayashi further testified about the sneaker found soaking in the Johnson family's utility sink, with tests showing traces of blood despite attempts to clean it. The blood had seeped into the canvas in a way that made complete removal impossible without destroying the shoe itself, he explained, with subsequent DNA testing confirming it was Shannon's blood. The forensic evidence about the positioning of the bodies became even more significant when Kobayashi presented his analysis of the crime scene in relation to Milo's internet search history. The defendant's search for how to make two people stay together forever directly correlates with the unusual and deliberate arrangement of the victims, he testified, displaying side-by-side images of the crime scene and the search query from Milo's phone. This is not a coincidence, but a physical manifestation of a premeditated concept. Kobayashi went on to explain how this arrangement contradicted any claim of blind rage or impulse, as it required a return to rational thought and physical action after the violence itself had concluded. Someone in the grip of uncontrollable rage typically does not stop to arrange bodies in a symbolic tableau, he noted. This positioning required thought, intention, and a specific vision being carried out, directly linking to the defendant's search query from the previous evening. In a strategic move that visibly affected the jury, Prosecutor Wright had Kobayashi present a detailed timeline integrating both physical and digital evidence. At 8:17 p.m., the TikTok video shows Shannon and Ricky kissing, he began, displaying a multimedia timeline on the courtroom screen. At 8:35 p.m., the threatening message is sent from the defendant's fake Instagram account using the Wilson home's Wi-Fi. At approximately 8:40 p.m., based on witness testimony, the defendant goes to the basement bathroom where Emily Tanner encounters him. At 8:43 p.m., according to the medical examiner's time of death estimate, the murders occur. At 9:08 p.m., surveillance footage shows the defendant disposing of bloody clothing at the Shell Station. And at 9:26 p.m., according to cell phone tower data, the defendant arrives at his home, where he attempts to clean the remaining sneaker in the utility sink and hides the second knife under his mattress. The timeline created a devastatingly clear narrative of Milo's actions before, during, and after the murders, with each piece of evidence corroborating the others. Defense attorney Emerson's strategy had shifted significantly by this point in the trial, as the forensic evidence had made the initial claim that Milo merely discovered the bodies untenable. Instead, Emerson now focused on challenging the element of premeditation required for first-degree murder. "Mr. Kobayashi," he began during cross-examination, "is it possible that the arrangement of the bodies was not premeditated, but rather an impulsive act after the violence had occurred?" Kobayashi considered this before responding. "It's possible, but unlikely given the correlation with the internet search from the previous evening." Emerson pressed further. "But you can't definitively state what was in the defendant's mind at that moment, correct?" Kobayashi conceded this point, allowing Emerson to suggest an alternative narrative, that Milo had indeed killed Shannon and Ricky in a moment of adolescent rage, but the arrangement of the bodies was a confused post-violence attempt to make sense of what he had done rather than the fulfillment of a premeditated plan. The most emotionally charged testimony about the forensic evidence came when Prosecutor Wright called Derek Wilson, Ricky's father, to describe finding the bodies of his son and Shannon. "I heard what sounded like a thud from the basement, followed by silence, which seemed strange for a party of teenagers," he testified, his voice steady despite the obvious emotional strain. "When I went down to check on them, I first noticed that the music had stopped. Then I saw—" His voice broke momentarily before he composed himself. "I saw Shannon and Ricky lying on the floor side by side, with blood everywhere. The other kids were huddled in the corner, paralyzed with shock." Mr. Wilson described how he had immediately rushed the surviving children upstairs and called 911, his training as a former EMT kicking in despite his horror at finding his son murdered at his own birthday party. "I knew immediately they were gone," he said quietly. "The amount of blood, the lack of movement, but what struck me most was how they were positioned, like someone had arranged them that way. It wasn't natural. It looked deliberate." When Wright asked if he had noticed anyone missing from the group of surviving children, Mr. Wilson nodded. "Yes, Milo Johnson wasn't there. I specifically remember thinking it was strange because I had seen him earlier in the evening, and no one had told me he was leaving." This testimony directly contradicted the story Milo had initially told his parents about informing the adult hosts he wasn't feeling well before leaving. Mr. Wilson further testified that when he asked the surviving children what had happened, they had been too traumatized to speak coherently, except for one girl who kept repeating, "Milo did it." Wright then asked if Mr. Wilson had noticed anything unusual about Milo's behavior earlier in the evening. "He was very quiet, watching Shannon and Ricky more than participating in the party," he recalled. "At one point, I offered him some cake, and he just stared at me before saying, 'No, thank you,' in this flat voice that seemed odd." The forensic narrative took an even more disturbing turn when Wright called Dr. Robert Chen, the forensic psychiatrist who specialized in juvenile offenders. Unlike Dr. Meadows, who had testified for the defense about general adolescent brain development, Dr. Chen had conducted a specific evaluation of Milo Johnson and reviewed all the evidence in the case. "The deliberate positioning of the victims after death is psychologically significant," Dr. Chen testified. "It represents what we call undoing in forensic psychology, an attempt to transform the reality of what has occurred into something that aligns with the perpetrator's psychological needs." Chen explained that in this case, the arrangement of Shannon and Ricky side by side, appearing to be together even in death, suggested a paradoxical desire. On one level, the perpetrator wanted to punish Shannon for rejecting him and Ricky for taking her. But on another level, by positioning them together, he was fulfilling his search query, making them stay together forever in a way he could control, unlike their living relationship, which excluded him. When asked specifically about the relevance of Milo's age to this behavior, Dr. Chen offered testimony that struck a careful balance between acknowledging adolescent limitations and recognizing the deliberate nature of the actions. "A 13-year-old does indeed have an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex," as Dr. Meadows correctly testified, he acknowledged. However, the pattern of behavior in this case, creating a fake account to continue contacting someone who had rejected him, conducting specific searches about making people stay together forever, taking 2 knives from the kitchen, and arranging the bodies after death, shows a level of planning and intentionality that goes beyond a simple failure of impulse control. Chen concluded that while Milo's adolescent brain certainly influenced his emotional processing and decision-making, the evidence showed a sustained pattern of deliberate choices over time, culminating in premeditated violence followed by symbolic positioning of the victims, actions that demonstrate awareness of both meaning and consequence despite the perpetrator's young age. As the 7th day of testimony concluded, Judge Blackwell addressed a motion from the defense requesting that certain crime scene photographs be removed from evidence due to their potential to prejudice the jury. The court recognizes the graphic nature of these images, Judge Blackwell stated, but finds that their probative value in demonstrating the deliberate positioning of the victims outweighs their potentially prejudicial impact. This ruling allowed the prosecution to continue referencing the arrangement of the bodies as a key piece of evidence connecting Milo's internet search to the physical crime scene. As court adjourned for the day, the jurors filed out with solemn expressions, several glancing at the 13-year-old defendant, who sat at the defense table staring straight ahead, his face showing no reaction to the damning forensic evidence that had been presented against him throughout the day's proceedings. Dr. Vanessa Meadows adjusted her glasses as defense exhibits appeared on the courtroom screens, colorful brain scans showing the dramatic differences between adolescent and adult neurological development. "What you're seeing here," she explained to the jury, pointing to areas highlighted in red, "is the incomplete development of the prefrontal cortex in a typical 13-year-old brain." As the defense's key expert witness on adolescent psychology, Dr. Meadows had been tasked with helping the jury understand why a child Milo's age should not be held to adult standards of reasoning and intent. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for impulse control, understanding consequences, and regulating emotional responses, she continued, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had spent 2 decades studying child development. At 13, this crucial brain region is simply not finished developing, which neurologically limits a child's ability to process intense emotions, particularly rejection, which activates the same pain centers in the brain as physical injury. The courtroom remained silent as Dr. Meadows explained the concept of emotional flooding in adolescence, the neurological state in which intense feelings overwhelm the brain's limited regulatory capacity. When a 13-year-old experiences what we might consider normal social disappointments, a romantic rejection, a perceived betrayal by a friend, their underdeveloped brain can become completely overwhelmed, she testified. They lack the neurological hardware to process these emotions the way an adult would, potentially leading to what appears to be extreme or disproportionate reactions. Defense attorney Marcus Emerson guided her testimony carefully, establishing the scientific consensus on adolescent brain development before asking the question central to their case. In your professional opinion, Dr. Meadows, is a 13-year-old capable of forming the same level of premeditated intent as an adult? Meadows shook her head definitively. No, they are not. Even when they appear to plan or prepare for an action, they lack the neurological capacity to fully comprehend long-term consequences or to regulate their emotional responses when triggered. Prosecutor Olivia Wright approached the witness stand with measured steps, her cross-examination strategy focusing not on challenging the science itself, but on applying it to Milo's specific behavior pattern. Dr. Meadows, would you agree that different 13-year-olds might have different levels of emotional regulation ability? She asked. Meadows acknowledged this was true. And would you agree that while impulse control might be limited in adolescence, many 13-year-olds still understand that killing is wrong? Meadows hesitated before conceding, yes, most do understand that on a basic level. Wright then displayed the timeline of Milo's actions, creating the fake Instagram account 2 weeks before the murders, sending escalating threats, conducting specific searches the night before, taking 2 knives from the Wilson kitchen, and arranging the bodies after death. Looking at this pattern of behavior, Dr. Meadows, doesn't this suggest something beyond a simple failure of impulse control in the moment? Meadows attempted to frame these actions within her neurological model, but Wright persisted. Isn't it possible for a 13-year-old to have diminished impulse control, yet still form intent and take deliberate actions over time? The prosecution's expert witness, Dr. Robert Chen, offered a counterpoint to Meadows' testimony that acknowledged adolescent limitations while still holding Milo accountable for his actions. Adolescent brains are indeed different from adult brains, Dr. Chen confirmed, displaying his own set of neurological images. However, we must be careful not to use this difference to excuse all behavior or to suggest that teenagers are incapable of premeditation or understanding consequences. Chen explained the concept of a progression of intent in adolescent offenders, how initial emotional reactions can evolve into more deliberate plans over time, particularly when fueled by rumination on perceived wrongs. The creation of a fake Instagram account to continue contacting Shannon after being blocked shows planning and awareness that his attention was unwanted, Chen testified. The escalating nature of the messages over a 2-week period indicates this wasn't a sudden impulse, but a developing fixation with increasing hostility. Dr. Chen's most compelling testimony came when he analyzed Milo's search history in the context of adolescent psychology. The search for how to make someone regret rejecting you shows awareness that his feelings stemmed from rejection, Chen explained. More tellingly, the search for what happens if a minor commits murder demonstrates an understanding that killing is wrong, that there are consequences, and, significantly, that those consequences might be different because of his age. This last point resonated visibly with the jury. The search suggested not just awareness of wrongdoing, but a calculating consideration of how his age might affect punishment. Finally, the search for how to make 2 people stay together forever, followed by the deliberate positioning of the bodies in exactly that manner, shows a connection between thought and action that is difficult to dismiss as mere impulse, Chen concluded. While his adolescent brain certainly influenced his emotional processing, the evidence shows a capacity for planning and intent that must be recognized alongside those developmental limitations. The testimony about Milo's developmental psychology took an unexpected turn when his 7th-grade teacher, Ms. Rebecca Palmer, was called to testify about his classroom behavior. Milo was always what we might call a rigid child, she explained, her voice carrying the practiced patience of a veteran middle school teacher. He struggled with transitions or changes to routines, became fixated on perceived slights from classmates, and had difficulty regulating his emotional responses to disappointment. Ms. Palmer described an incident from the previous year when Milo had meticulously vandalized another student's science project after that student was paired with Milo's preferred lab partner. What struck me wasn't just the action itself, but how he planned it over several days, waiting for the right moment when no one was watching, she recalled. When confronted, he showed little remorse, saying the other boy deserved it for taking his partner. School counselor David Jennings provided additional context about Milo's psychological profile through his testimony about their interactions in the months leading up to the murders. In December 2021, Milo's teachers referred him to me due to concerns about his social interactions and rigidity, Jennings testified. In our sessions, I observed what appeared to be difficulty with perspective-taking, understanding that others have feelings and viewpoints separate from his own. Jennings described how Milo often interpreted neutral actions by peers as personally targeted rejections, and how he struggled to move past perceived slights, returning to them repeatedly in conversations weeks later. In early January, shortly after the winter dance, Milo began talking about Shannon frequently, describing her as his girlfriend, even though when I spoke with her separately, she characterized their relationship very differently. Jennings had been concerned enough to schedule additional sessions with Milo, but the boy had stopped attending after the second meeting, telling his parents he didn't need counseling anymore. When the defense called Diane Johnson, Milo's mother, to testify about her son's developmental history, the courtroom atmosphere shifted noticeably. Gone was the fierce maternal defender from the early interrogations, replaced by a woman who appeared hollowed by grief and realization, her testimony reflecting the complex position of loving her child while no longer being able to deny his actions. Milo was always different from other children, she began softly, twisting a tissue in her hands. He was walking and talking early, but struggled with making friends, with handling disappointment, with understanding why other children didn't want to play the way he wanted to play. She described a child who excelled academically but struggled socially, who became intensely fixated on interests and people, who had meltdowns well beyond the age when most children outgrow such behavior. "We sought help when he was younger," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But when the therapist suggested he might have social, emotional, processing differences that needed ongoing support, we thought she was exaggerating. We thought he would grow out of it." The most telling moment in Diane Johnson's testimony came when Prosecutor Wright asked about Milo's reaction to the winter dance, where he had kissed Shannon Lewis. "He came home elated," Diane recalled. "He talked about Shannon constantly, called her his girlfriend, planned their future together, all from one kiss at a school dance." She described how her son's mood had darkened dramatically in the days that followed when Shannon stopped responding to his messages. He became fixated on his phone, checking it constantly, becoming more agitated and withdrawn. Wright then asked if Diane had been aware of the fake Instagram account or the extent of Milo's digital stalking of Shannon. "No," she admitted, tears falling freely now. "We monitored his regular social media, but had no idea he had created another account. We thought he was just experiencing normal teenage heartbreak." The pain in her voice was palpable as she added, if we had just known how deep it went." Dr. Lena Rivera, a neuropsychologist specializing in atypical adolescent development, provided testimony that contextualized Milo's behavior within a broader framework than either the defense or prosecution had previously presented. "Some adolescents experience rejection and social challenges differently than their peers due to underlying neurodevelopmental differences," she explained, careful to note that she had not personally evaluated Milo, but was speaking about patterns observed in similar cases. When these differences aren't recognized and supported appropriately, they can lead to maladaptive coping mechanisms, including obsessive thinking patterns, difficulty distinguishing between typical social interactions and perceived rejections, and in rare cases, retaliatory behaviors that escalate beyond typical teenage reactions. Dr. Rivera described how such adolescents might appear to function normally in many contexts while struggling significantly with emotional regulation in others, particularly involving rejection or perceived betrayal by peers. Throughout the psychological testimony, Milo Johnson sat at the defense table with the same flat affect he had maintained since the trial began, occasionally writing notes to his attorney, but showing little visible reaction to even the most personal testimonies about his development and behavior. The jury, however, could be seen watching him intently during these moments, perhaps searching for signs of the emotional volatility described by the experts or indications of the rigid, obsessive thinking patterns outlined in the testimony. Judge Blackwell had repeatedly instructed the jury not to interpret the defendant's courtroom demeanor as evidence of either guilt or innocence, reminding them that how a 13-year-old might present himself during a murder trial could be influenced by many factors unrelated to the case itself. The battle of psychological experts reached its climax when the prosecution recalled Dr. Chen for rebuttal testimony, specifically addressing Milo's understanding of consequences at the time of the murders. The search query, "What happens if a minor commits murder?" is particularly significant, Chen emphasized, pointing to the timestamp showing it had been conducted approximately 36 hours before the killings. This search demonstrates three critical awareness factors. First, an understanding that killing another person is murder. Second, an awareness that there are consequences for such an action. And third, a specific consideration of how his status as a minor might affect those consequences. Chen explained that this search directly contradicted the defense's claim that Milo had acted without understanding the nature or consequences of his actions. This is not the search of someone who lacks the capacity to understand what killing means, Chen stated firmly. This is the search of someone considering murder while calculating how his age might mitigate punishment. In her closing argument on the psychological evidence, Prosecutor Wright acknowledged the reality of adolescent brain development while refusing to allow it to excuse Milo's actions. Science tells us that 13-year-old brains are different from adult brains, she conceded, and the law recognizes this in many ways. But science also tells us that 13-year-olds understand that killing is wrong. They understand that actions have consequences. She walked the jury through the progression of Milo's behavior, from initial rejection to digital stalking to explicit threats to murder, emphasizing that each step showed awareness and intent, regardless of his age. Milo Johnson experienced the emotional flood of rejection that many teenagers face, Wright concluded. But unlike most teenagers, he responded by methodically planning and executing the murders of two classmates, arranging their bodies in a way that fulfilled his search for how to make two people stay together forever. His age helps us understand his actions, but it cannot and should not excuse them. Defense attorney Emerson's final argument on the psychological evidence attempted to refocus the jury on the limitations of adolescent development, rather than Milo's specific actions. The science is clear and undisputed, he insisted. A 13-year-old brain simply cannot process emotions, consequences, and impulse control the way an adult brain can. Emerson urged the jury to view each piece of evidence through this developmental lens. The fake Instagram account as a misguided attempt to maintain connection after rejection, the threatening messages as immature expressions of hurt rather than genuine intent, and even the positioning of the bodies as a confused, post-violence attempt to make sense of actions taken in an emotionally flooded state. The law must account for the neurological reality that adolescents are works in progress, Emerson concluded. Holding Milo to adult standards of intent and premeditation ignores everything science has taught us about the developing brain and its limitations. As the 8th day of testimony concluded, Judge Blackwell instructed the jury that they would hear from one final witness the following day, Milo Johnson himself. The announcement sent murmurs through the courtroom. Having a 13-year-old defendant testify in his own murder trial was unusual and potentially risky for the defense. But as Marcus Emerson later explained to reporters outside the courthouse, the jury needs to hear from Milo directly to understand the limited perspective from which he experienced these events. What neither the defense nor the prosecution could predict was how this testimony would ultimately seal Milo's fate, as the careful psychological narrative Emerson had constructed would soon collapse under the weight of the 13-year-old's own words when faced with the evidence of his actions. The courtroom fell completely silent as Milo Johnson took the witness stand on the 9th day of trial. The 13-year-old defendant, looking even younger in the navy blue suit his parents had purchased for the proceedings. His sandy blonde hair had been neatly combed, and his freckled face appeared pale against the dark collar of his shirt as he placed his small hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Defense attorney Marcus Emerson began with gentle questions designed to humanize his young client, asking about school, basketball, and his home life. Milo's responses came in a soft, carefully measured voice that occasionally cracked with adolescent pitch changes. "I like math and science best," he stated when asked about favorite subjects. "I play basketball, but I'm not as good as Ricky was." The past tense reference to his victim didn't go unnoticed by the jury, several of whom exchanged glances at this unguarded moment of acknowledgement. Emerson gradually steered the testimony toward the events leading up to the murders, establishing the narrative they hoped would resonate with the jury's understanding of adolescent emotion. "Can you tell us about the winter dance in January?" he asked. Milo's demeanor shifted slightly, his shoulders tensing as he responded, "Shannon and I danced together, and at the end of the night we kissed. It was my first kiss." When asked how that made him feel, Milo's rehearsed response came across as flat rather than authentic. "I thought it meant she was my girlfriend. I thought we had a special connection." Emerson prompted him to describe what happened in the days following the dance, and Milo explained how Shannon had initially responded to his text, but then became increasingly distant before stopping altogether. "I didn't understand why," he said, staring down at his hands. "I kept trying to talk to her, but she blocked me on Instagram." The defense strategy began to show strain when Emerson addressed the fake Instagram account directly, attempting to frame it as an impulsive decision rather than calculated stalking. "Why did you create the Watching You Be Always 13 account?" he asked carefully. Milo's response lacked the emotional context Emerson had clearly hoped for. "Because she blocked my regular account, and I still wanted to talk to her." When pressed about the increasingly threatening messages sent from this account, Milo struggled to provide the emotionally immature explanation the defense narrative required, instead stating simply, "I was angry that she was ignoring me after we kissed." Emerson tried to redirect, asking how it felt to see Shannon becoming close with Ricky, but Milo's response, "It felt like they were both betraying me," came across as entitled rather than demonstrating the overwhelming emotional flood the defense had described in their psychological testimony. The most damaging moment for the defense came when Emerson, apparently hoping to establish Milo's limited understanding of consequences, asked about the search for what happens if a minor commits murder. Rather than expressing confusion or diminished capacity, Milo's explanation revealed a disturbing level of calculation. "I wanted to know if I would go to adult prison or juvenile detention if I did something really bad." The courtroom remained deadly silent as the implication of this statement sank in. Far from lacking understanding of consequences, Milo had specifically researched how his age might affect punishment. Emerson visibly struggled to recover from this unexpected response, quickly moving to questions about the night of the murders, but the damage had been done. The jury had heard directly from Milo's own mouth that he had researched the consequences of murder while considering his status as a minor. Prosecutor Olivia Wright approached the witness stand for a cross-examination with measured confidence, her strategy clear from the first question. "Milo, you testified that you were upset when Shannon blocked your regular Instagram account, correct?" When he nodded, Wright continued, "So you created a fake account specifically to continue contacting her after she had made it clear she didn't want to talk to you, correct?" Milo shifted uncomfortably before answering, "Yes?" Wright's questioning methodically walked through the timeline established by the digital evidence, having Milo confirm each step, creating the fake account, sending over 200 messages in 2 weeks, physically following Shannon home from school, conducting the searches about making someone regret rejection, and what happens if a minor commits murder. Rather than challenging his answers, Wright simply had him confirm the actions already established by evidence, allowing his own admissions to build the case against him. The cross-examination reached its critical point when Wright displayed the TikTok video showing Shannon and Ricky kissing during the Truth or Dare game, freezing on the frame of Milo's face, contorted with rage. "That's you in this video, correct?" she asked. Milo nodded, unable to deny his own image. "And this was taken approximately 20 minutes before Shannon and Ricky were killed?" Another nod. Wright then displayed the message sent from Milo's fake account using the Wilson Homes Wi-Fi. "I see you with him. You'll regret this. Timestamp 8:35 p.m. "You sent this message after seeing them kiss during the game, didn't you?" she pressed. Milo hesitated before answering, "Yes." Wright continued relentlessly, "And what exactly did you mean when you wrote that Shannon would regret this?" The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as Milo struggled to find an answer that wouldn't incriminate him further, finally responding, "I just wanted to scare her." Wright then moved to the most disturbing aspect of the crime, the deliberate positioning of the bodies after death. "Milo, the night before the murders, you searched for how to make two people stay together forever, correct?" When he reluctantly confirmed this, Wright displayed the crime scene photo showing Shannon and Ricky arranged side by side, their faces turned toward each other. "And after stabbing Shannon and Ricky multiple times, you arranged their bodies like this, didn't you?" she asked, her voice firm but not angry. Milo stared at the photo for a long moment before answering in a voice barely above a whisper, "Yes." Wright pressed further, "Why did you position them this way?" The question hung in the air for several seconds before Milo answered with unexpected honesty, "Because if I couldn't have her, at least I could control how they would be together." The response sent murmurs through the courtroom, providing the clearest window yet into the disturbing thought process behind the murders. The most devastating exchange for Milo's defense came when Wright addressed his initial claim of merely discovering the bodies. "You told Detective Hall that you found Shannon and Ricky already dead, isn't that right?" she asked. Milo nodded, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "But that wasn't true, was it?" Wright continued. "You didn't find them already dead. You killed them yourself, and then arranged their bodies side by side." For a moment it seemed Milo might continue to deny his actions, but then his composure cracked entirely. "They deserved it," he burst out, his voice rising with sudden emotion that had been absent throughout his testimony. "She kissed me first and then just threw me away for Ricky. They were laughing at me, both of them." The outburst silenced the courtroom, with even Marcus Emerson appearing stunned by his client's sudden shift from carefully controlled responses to raw anger. Taking advantage of this moment of emotional truth, Wright gently pressed further. "So, when you went to the basement bathroom shortly before the murders, you weren't going there just to use the facilities, were you?" she asked. Milo, his momentary outburst fading, shook his head. "No," he admitted quietly. "I went to think about what I was going to do." Wright nodded, maintaining a calm, non-confrontational tone as she asked, "And what were you thinking about in that bathroom, Milo?" The 13-year-old stared at his hands for a long moment before answering in a voice that carried clearly through the silent courtroom. "I was thinking that they shouldn't be allowed to be together if I couldn't have Shannon." Wright let the statement hang in the air before asking her final question. "So when Emily Tanner heard you say, 'Some things can't be fixed, but some things can be made right,' you were referring to your plan to kill Shannon and Ricky, weren't you?" Milo looked up, meeting her eyes directly for the first time, and nodded once before saying simply, "Yes." As Milo stepped down from the witness stand, the impact of his testimony was evident on the faces of the jury, many of whom appeared visibly disturbed by what they had heard. Rather than reinforcing the defense narrative of a confused child overwhelmed by emotion, Milo's own words had revealed a disturbing level of awareness and intent behind his actions. He had admitted to creating the fake account specifically to continue contacting Shannon after being blocked, to researching the legal consequences of murder with consideration for his age, to sending the threatening message immediately after seeing Shannon and Ricky kiss, and, most damningly, to arranging their bodies in a deliberate tableau that fulfilled his search for how to make two people stay together forever. Each admission had systematically undermined the defense's claims of diminished capacity and impulsive action, replacing them with evidence of planning, awareness, and intent that was all the more chilling coming from the mouth of a 13-year-old. In their closing arguments, both attorneys framed Milo's testimony within their competing narratives of the case. Defense attorney Emerson attempted damage control, arguing that Milo's outburst about Shannon and Ricky deserving it demonstrated exactly the kind of emotional immaturity and impulsivity they had been describing throughout the trial. "You heard directly from Milo how overwhelming these feelings were for him," Emerson insisted. "This is precisely what the experts described, a 13-year-old brain flooded with emotions it cannot properly regulate, leading to tragic consequences." He urged the jury to consider not just what Milo had done, but his capacity to fully understand those actions given his developmental stage, arguing that while the killings were undeniably horrific, they represented manslaughter rather than premeditated murder due to Milo's limited adolescent brain development. Prosecutor Wright's closing argument, conversely, used Milo's testimony to cement the narrative of premeditation and intent they had built throughout the trial. "You heard from Milo's own mouth that he researched what would happen if a minor committed murder before killing Shannon and Ricky," she reminded the jury. "You heard him admit that he positioned their bodies to fulfill his search for how to make two people stay together forever. And most tellingly, you heard him express the true motive behind these killings: control." Wright acknowledged Milo's youth and the legitimate science regarding adolescent brain development, but argued that this particular adolescent had demonstrated the specific capacity for intent required for first-degree murder through his own actions and admissions. "The question before you is not whether 13-year-olds in general can form premeditated intent," she concluded, "but whether this 13-year-old did so in this case." Milo's own words, along with the overwhelming physical and digital evidence, confirm that he did. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, the courtroom remained unusually quiet, the weight of what had transpired during Milo's testimony hanging heavy in the air. Shannon's and Ricky's families sat with tears streaming down their faces, having heard for the first time the defendant openly admit to killing their children and arranging their bodies in a macabre tableau. The Johnson family appeared equally devastated, Diane sobbing quietly into her husband's shoulder, while Anthony stared straight ahead, his face ashen. Milo himself was led back to the holding area, his expression once again carefully blank. The emotional outburst during cross-examination, now contained behind the mask of indifference he had maintained throughout most of the proceedings. As Judge Blackwell adjourned court for the day, observers noted that for the first time since the trial began, no one from either side spoke to reporters waiting outside. The raw truth revealed in Milo's testimony had left everyone, even the most experienced legal professionals, struggling to find adequate words for what they had witnessed. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before reaching their verdict, returning to the courtroom as a heavy rain began to fall outside, drumming against the windows like an appropriate soundtrack for the somber proceedings. The foreman, a middle-aged woman who had been taking meticulous notes throughout the trial, handed the verdict form to the bailiff with a hand that trembled slightly. As Judge Blackwell read the decision aloud, "On the count of murder in the first degree of Shannon Lewis, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of murder in the first degree of Richard Wilson, we find the defendant guilty." Milo Johnson sat perfectly still, his expression unchanged, while around him adults on both sides of the courtroom broke down in tears. The swift decision suggested that despite the defense's best efforts to frame the case within the context of adolescent brain development, Milo's own testimony had removed any reasonable doubt about his actions and intent. The jury had concluded that regardless of his age, Milo Johnson had committed premeditated murder with a full understanding of what he was doing. Judge Blackwell scheduled sentencing for the following week, ordering that Milo undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation before that hearing. As the 13-year-old was led from the courtroom in handcuffs that appeared too large for his wrists, reporters noted that for the first time since his arrest, he showed a visible emotional response, not remorse or fear, but a single glance back at Shannon's mother, his expression flickering briefly with what one journalist would later describe as a disturbing mixture of satisfaction and resentment. That final look, captured by courtroom cameras and soon to be analyzed endlessly on cable news programs across the country, would become the lasting image of a trial that had forced an uncomfortable national conversation about juvenile justice, adolescent brain development, and the limits of youth as a mitigating factor in the most heinous of crimes. The question that had begun with Milo Johnson's digital search, "What happens if a minor commits murder?" was about to be answered in a way that would shock the nation. Judge Elias Blackwell's courtroom was filled beyond capacity on February 28, 2022, as spectators, media representatives, and legal observers gathered for what promised to be a landmark sentencing hearing in the case of 13-year-old Milo Johnson. Extra security measures had been implemented throughout the Portland County Courthouse, with metal detectors at every entrance and uniformed officers positioned along the hallways leading to Courtroom 3. The case had ignited fierce debate across the nation about juvenile justice reform, with legal experts appearing on cable news programs to discuss the appropriate boundaries between rehabilitation and punishment when the perpetrator was still technically a child. Inside the courtroom, the families of Shannon Lewis and Ricky Wilson sat together in the front row behind the prosecution table, holding hands across what had once been separate family units, but was now a shared experience of unimaginable loss. Across the aisle, Diane and Anthony Johnson sat alone in the first row behind the defense, the supporters who had flanked them during the early days of the trial now notably absent. The psychological evaluation ordered by Judge Blackwell had been completed over the previous week, with Dr. Vanessa Meadows conducting interviews with Milo at the juvenile detention facility where he was being held pending sentencing. Her report, now sealed in a manila envelope on the judge's bench, contained not only her assessment of Milo's psychological state, but also her recommendations regarding appropriate sentencing given his age and developmental stage. Defense attorney Marcus Emerson had filed a substantial sentencing memorandum arguing that despite the jury's finding of guilt on first-degree murder charges, the court should exercise its discretion to sentence Milo as a juvenile rather than an adult, emphasizing rehabilitation over punishment. Prosecutor Olivia Wright had filed an equally substantial response, arguing that the premeditated nature of the crimes, combined with Milo's own testimony demonstrating awareness and intent, justified adult sentencing despite his youth. Milo Johnson was led into the courtroom wearing a juvenile detention uniform rather than the suit he had worn during trial, the orange fabric hanging loosely on his small frame. The 13-year-old's appearance had changed noticeably in the week since the verdict. His face appeared thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, suggesting difficulty sleeping, and his previous blank affect had been replaced with nervous energy as he continuously scanned the crowded courtroom. When he spotted his parents, he offered them a small wave that neither returned, their expressions reflecting the complex emotional reality of loving a child who had committed an unforgivable act. Dr. Meadows sat in the second row behind the defense table, her professional demeanor masking any indication of the contents of her sealed report, while Dr. Robert Chen, the prosecution's expert, sat opposite her behind the state's table. Judge Blackwell entered the courtroom with a grave expression, acknowledging the weight of the decision before him, with a solemn nod to both legal teams before taking his seat. "We are here today for sentencing in the matter of State of Oregon versus Milo Johnson," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "Before hearing from the families of the victims and from counsel, I wish to address certain procedural matters." The judge explained that he had reviewed both the defense and prosecution sentencing memoranda, as well as Dr. Meadows's psychological evaluation. He then addressed the unique legal circumstance of the case. The defendant has been convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, crimes which normally carry mandatory minimum sentences under Oregon law. However, due to the defendant's age of 13 years at the time of the offenses, the court has greater discretion in sentencing than would be the case with an adult offender. The victim impact statements began with Carla Lewis, Shannon's mother, who approached the podium clutching a photograph of her daughter. "Shannon was 13 years old when she was murdered," Carla began, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. She was just beginning to figure out who she was and who she wanted to become. She described a daughter who loved basketball and science, who wanted to be a marine biologist, who had just started experimenting with makeup and changing her hairstyle every week. "Shannon was kind to everyone, including Milo," she continued, glancing briefly at the defendant. "When she realized he had misinterpreted their kiss at the dance, she tried to let him down gently because she didn't want to hurt his feelings. Her reward for that kindness was to be stabbed 17 times by someone she considered a friend." Carla concluded by addressing Milo directly. "You didn't just take Shannon's life. You took her future, her dreams, everything she could have been and done and experienced. You took her first real boyfriend, her high school graduation, her college years, her career, her chance to fall in love and get married, and have children of her own. You took all of it in a moment of jealous rage because you couldn't accept that she didn't want to be with you." Derek Wilson, Ricky's father, spoke next, his tall frame seeming diminished by grief as he stood at the podium. "My son died on his 13th birthday," he stated simply, the words hanging in the air for a long moment before he continued. "The cake I baked for him that morning was still on the table, the candles never blown out, when I found him murdered in our basement." Derek described Ricky as a talented basketball player who worked hard at school despite struggling with dyslexia, a loyal friend who stood up for kids being bullied, a son who still happily hugged his parents in public despite being a teenager. Ricky's only crime was liking the same girl that Milo liked, and being liked by her in return, Derek said, his voice breaking. For that he was stabbed 23 times, primarily in his face, as if Milo wanted to destroy the face that Shannon had chosen to kiss instead of his. Like Carla, Derek concluded by addressing Milo directly. "You have taken everything from us, our only child, our future grandchildren, the sound of Ricky's laughter in our home, all gone. And for what? Because a girl liked him instead of you? Because he was more popular, more athletic, more socially comfortable than you? These are not reasons to kill. There are no reasons that could ever justify what you did." The courtroom remained utterly silent as Margaret Wilson, Ricky's mother, approached the podium still clutching the tissue she had used to wipe away tears during her husband's statement. "I keep setting Ricky's place at the dinner table," she began, her voice barely audible until Judge Blackwell gently asked her to speak into the microphone. Every night for the first week after he was killed, I set out a plate for him, before remembering he's never coming home again. Margaret described the physical pain of grief, how it felt like having your heart torn from your chest, while somehow still being expected to breathe, to function, to continue existing in a world without your child. She spoke of the nightmares that plagued her, dreams where she entered the basement again and again to find her son's body arranged like a doll in some twisted playhouse scene. Looking directly at Milo, she asked the question that had tormented her since the murders. Why did you have to kill him? If you were angry at Shannon, why did Ricky have to die too? Was it just because he was loved by someone you wanted for yourself? Vincent Lewis, Shannon's father, was the last family member to speak, his statement the briefest but perhaps most impactful of all. A former Marine who had served in Afghanistan, Vincent stood ramrod straight at the podium, his military bearing intact even as tears filled his eyes. "I've seen death in combat," he stated. "I've lost friends to violence, but nothing prepares a parent for seeing their child in a morgue, their body mutilated by someone they trusted." He looked directly at Milo, his gaze unwavering as he continued. "You researched what would happen if a minor committed murder. You wanted to know if you'd go to juvenile detention or adult prison. Well, I hope you get your answer today, and I hope it's the one you feared when you typed that search." Vincent concluded with words that would later be quoted in news reports nationwide. "My daughter will never turn 14, never go to high school, never fall in love for real. But you, Milo Johnson, you will grow up. And I hope that every day of your life, as you get to experience the things you stole from Shannon and Ricky, you remember what you did and why you're where you are." Following the victim impact statements, defense attorney Marcus Emerson presented his arguments for juvenile sentencing, emphasizing rehabilitation over punishment. "Your Honor, no one in this courtroom disputes the tragedy of what occurred or the pain these families are experiencing," he began carefully. "But we must remember that the defendant was 13 years old at the time of these crimes, a child whose brain was and is still developing." Emerson cited extensive scientific research on adolescent brain development, arguing that Milo's actions, while horrific, were influenced by neurological limitations that affected his impulse control and decision-making. The juvenile justice system was created precisely for cases like this, he insisted, where a young person has committed serious crimes but still has the capacity for rehabilitation, for growth, for eventually returning to society as a productive citizen. Emerson introduced Dr. Meadows' psychological evaluation, which recommended intensive therapeutic intervention in a secure juvenile facility rather than adult incarceration, suggesting that with proper treatment, Milo could potentially be rehabilitated by his mid-20s. Prosecutor Olivia Wright approached her sentencing argument with measured gravity, acknowledging Milo's youth while emphasizing the deliberate nature of his crimes. "Your Honor, the state recognizes that sentencing a 13-year-old for any crime, let alone murder, requires careful consideration of factors not present in adult cases," she began. "However, this is not a case of impulsive violence or a momentary lapse in judgment." Wright methodically reviewed the evidence of premeditation, the creation of the fake Instagram account, the escalating threats over 2 weeks, the specific searches about making people regret rejection, and what happens if a minor commits murder, taking 2 knives from the Wilson kitchen and arranging the bodies after death. Each of these actions required planning, awareness, and intent, she argued. And while we accept the science that tells us adolescent brains are still developing, we must also recognize that this particular adolescent demonstrated the specific capacity to form the intent required for first-degree murder through his own actions and admissions. Wright's most compelling argument came when she addressed the search for What happens if a minor commits murder, which had become central to the case. This search, conducted the night before the killings, demonstrates three crucial awareness factors, she explained. First, an understanding that killing another person is murder, a concept Milo clearly comprehended. Second, an awareness that murder has legal consequences, again, something Milo understood. And third, a specific consideration of how his status as a minor might affect those consequences, showing not diminished capacity, but calculating self-interest. Wright argued that this search alone demonstrated that Milo had considered the consequences of his actions with sufficient clarity to justify adult sentencing, regardless of his age. The question before this court is not whether 13-year-olds in general can or should be held to adult standards, she concluded, but whether this particular 13-year-old who researched the consequences of murder before committing it, who arranged his victims in a tableau matching his internet search, and who admitted on the stand to killing them because they deserved it, should face consequences proportionate to his actions. After hearing from both sides, Judge Blackwell announced that he would take a brief recess before delivering his sentencing decision. For 45 minutes, the courtroom remained filled as spectators waited anxiously, legal experts in the gallery whispering predictions to one another about the likely outcome. Most anticipated a hybrid sentence, perhaps a period in juvenile detention, until Milo turned 21, followed by a review to determine if he should be transferred to adult prison or released. Some speculated that the judge might order psychiatric commitment rather than standard incarceration, given Milo's age and the psychological aspects of the case. Almost no one predicted the decision that Judge Blackwell would ultimately deliver when he returned to the bench, his expression even graver than before. A thick folder of notes opened before him. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Blackwell instructed, and Milo Johnson stood beside his attorney, appearing suddenly very small in the large courtroom. The judge began by acknowledging the complexity of the case and the competing considerations before him. On one hand, we have a defendant who was 13 years old at the time of these crimes, an age at which the law has traditionally recognized diminished capacity and prioritized rehabilitation over punishment. On the other hand, we have crimes of exceptional brutality and clear premeditation, as evidenced by the defendant's digital footprint, physical actions, and own testimony. Blackwell then addressed Milo directly. "Young man, I have given considerable weight to your age, to the scientific evidence regarding adolescent brain development, and to the potential for rehabilitation that exists in someone so young. I have also reviewed Dr. Meadows' psychological evaluation, which recommends therapeutic intervention in a juvenile setting." The courtroom remained utterly silent as Judge Blackwell continued, his tone shifting. "However, I cannot ignore certain facts that distinguish this case from typical juvenile offenses. You created a fake account to stalk Shannon Lewis after she rejected you. You sent over 200 increasingly threatening messages over a 2-week period. You specifically searched for what happens if a minor commits murder, showing awareness of both the nature of your planned actions and potential legal consequences." Blackwell's voice grew firmer as he proceeded. "You took not one but 2 knives from the Wilson kitchen. You stabbed Shannon Lewis 17 times and Ricky Wilson 23 times with such force that the medical examiner noted it was remarkable, even for an adult attacker. And perhaps most disturbingly, you arranged their bodies side by side after death, fulfilling your search for how to make 2 people stay together forever, demonstrating not blind rage, but calculated, symbolic intent." Judge Blackwell then delivered the sentence that would make national headlines and spark fierce debate about juvenile justice reform. Milo Johnson, having been found guilty of 2 counts of murder in the first degree and having shown through your actions and testimony a level of premeditation and awareness that transcends typical adolescent limitations. This court sentences you to death by electric chair. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by shocked silence as the judge continued. I recognize this sentence is extraordinary given your age, but so are your crimes. You researched the consequences of murder as a minor, clearly hoping for leniency based on your youth. Today, you learn that some actions are so heinous that even a child can forfeit the protections normally afforded by age. In a statement that would be quoted in law school textbooks for years to come, Judge Blackwell looked directly at Milo and pronounced the words that gave the case its infamous name in legal circles. You don't deserve to breathe the same air as the rest of humanity after what you've done. You methodically ended 2 young lives over nothing more than rejected romantic attention, arranged their bodies like trophies, and showed no genuine remorse throughout these proceedings. While I recognize the unprecedented nature of this sentence for a defendant your age, I find that the premeditated brutality of these murders, combined with your demonstrated awareness of their wrongfulness through your internet searches, justifies this exceptional measure. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the sentence was pronounced. Diane Johnson collapsed in her husband's arms, wailing in disbelief, while Anthony stared at the judge in mute shock. Shannon's and Ricky's families embraced each other, their expressions a complex mixture of vindication and continued grief. Legal observers began furiously typing on phones and laptops, alerting colleagues to the unprecedented sentence. Even Marcus Emerson appeared stunned, automatically announcing, "We will appeal, Your Honor," while still processing the gravity of the decision. Prosecutor Wright sat motionless at her table, having argued for adult sentencing, but clearly not having anticipated a death sentence for a 13-year-old defendant. And at the center of it all stood Milo Johnson, his face finally showing genuine emotion, not remorse or fear, but a strange, almost confused expression, as if the reality of consequences he had researched but never truly understood was finally becoming clear to him. As Milo was led from the courtroom, reporters rushed to the hallways to file their stories about the most severe sentence given to a juvenile offender in modern American history. Legal experts immediately began debating whether the sentence would withstand appellate review, with most predicting it would be modified to life imprisonment without parole, itself an extraordinary sentence for a 13-year-old. Civil rights organizations announced plans to file amicus briefs supporting an appeal, arguing that regardless of the crime, sentencing a child to death violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Conservative commentators, conversely, defended the sentence as appropriate, given the premeditated nature of the murders and Milo's demonstrated awareness of consequences before committing them. In the days following the sentencing, Portland became the epicenter of a national conversation about juvenile justice, with protesters gathering daily outside the courthouse, holding signs with competing messages, "No child deserves death row" versus "Justice for Shannon and Ricky." Legal scholars appeared on news programs debating the constitutional, ethical, and practical implications of the sentence, with many predicting it would eventually reach the Supreme Court as a test case for the boundaries of juvenile sentencing. The American Psychological Association issued a statement expressing concern about sentencing based on selective interpretation of adolescent development research, while victims' rights organizations praised Judge Blackwell for prioritizing justice for the murdered children over considerations of the perpetrator's age. 6 months after sentencing, the Oregon Court of Appeals issued an expedited ruling on Milo Johnson's case, modifying the death sentence to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, while upholding the adult classification of the sentencing. The 3-judge panel wrote that while they found the death penalty disproportionate given the defendant's age at the time of the crimes. They also acknowledged the exceptional nature of the premeditation, the brutality of the attacks, and the defendant's demonstrated awareness of consequences through his internet searches. This modified sentence, still extraordinarily severe for a 13-year-old offender, would itself become the subject of further appeals and legal challenges over the years that followed, with Milo Johnson's name becoming synonymous in legal circles with the complex questions surrounding juvenile justice in cases of extreme violence. On the one-year anniversary of the murders, the Portland community gathered for a memorial service honoring Shannon Lewis and Ricky Wilson. The middle school gymnasium where they had once played basketball together was filled with students, teachers, and families, many wearing T-shirts printed with a photo of the two friends smiling together at a school event the previous fall. Both families had established scholarships in their children's names, the Shannon Lewis Marine Biology Scholarship and the Ricky Wilson Basketball Leadership Award, ensuring that something positive would emerge from the tragedy that had claimed their lives. As candles were lit and memories shared, the focus remained determinedly on who Shannon and Ricky had been and what they might have become, rather than on the boy whose jealousy and rage had ended their stories far too soon. Diane and Anthony Johnson had moved away from Portland in the months following their son's sentencing, unable to bear the whispers and stares that followed them everywhere in the community where their child had committed such notorious crimes. They divorced less than a year later, their marriage unable to withstand the strain of their shared grief, guilt, and the ongoing legal battles surrounding Milo's appeals. In separate interviews given years later, both would express their continued love for their son alongside their horror at his actions, the complex emotional reality of parenting a child who had committed the unthinkable. "We failed him somehow," Diane would tell a documentary filmmaker on the 5th anniversary of the case. "And because we failed him, Shannon and Ricky paid the ultimate price. That's something we live with every day alongside our love for the child we raised and our inability to reconcile that child with the person who committed those murders." Milo Johnson himself remained in the juvenile section of a maximum security prison, where he would stay until his 18th birthday before being transferred to the adult population. The skinny, freckle-faced 13-year-old who had arranged his victims in a macabre tableau gradually grew into a quiet, solitary young man who rarely spoke to other inmates and spent most of his time reading in his cell. Prison psychologists noted that he never expressed genuine remorse for the murders, maintaining the position that Shannon and Ricky had betrayed him and deserved what they got. His case continued through the appeals process, becoming a landmark in juvenile justice jurisprudence, cited in legal arguments and law school classrooms as courts across the country grappled with the difficult questions it raised. At what age can a child fully understand the consequences of murder? What is the appropriate balance between rehabilitation and punishment for juvenile offenders? And perhaps most fundamentally, when does a child's capacity for premeditation and awareness of wrongdoing justify treating them as an adult in the eyes of the law? As the years passed and Milo Johnson's case wound its way through the legal system, the underlying tragedy remained unchanged. Two 13-year-olds, Shannon Lewis and Ricky Wilson, had their lives and futures stolen because a boy couldn't accept rejection, and in his twisted logic, decided that if he couldn't have Shannon, no one could. Their names would be remembered in Portland long after the legal questions surrounding their killer's sentence had been resolved, their shortened lives honored through scholarships, community programs, and the ongoing efforts of their families to find meaning in a loss that defied understanding. And somewhere in the annals of criminal psychology, the case of Milo Johnson would stand as a stark reminder of how early the capacity for calculation, cruelty, and premeditated violence can manifest, and of the devastating consequences when juvenile obsession transforms into deadly rage.